Hey everybody, this is John from MTG Nexus, covering a little bit more of the London Mulligan Rule, and covering possibly which decks this will affect and benefit the most. As a friendly reminder, if you like what you're seeing on the channel, please consider subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, leaving a constructive comment down below, as we're mostly a Lightning Bolt and Burn channel, but we are covering things that affect the modern format, so don't forget to check out our page. So, which decks benefit most from the London Mulligan Rule? We had about 3 weeks of testing, 4 weeks of testing before Pro Tour London, Mythic Championship London, whatever you prefer to call it. We have the data from the Pro Tour, and we also have a couple of decks that popped up that we'll cover here in a second. But we really don't know which decks will benefit the most, and that's something we'll have to figure out. Let's jump into it. So the first deck that stands to benefit the most is Tron. Tron is Tron, which, if they get copies of Urza's Mine, Urza's Power Plant, and Urza's Tower into play, they tap for a combined 7 mana, get a bunch of very powerful payoffs. Essentially, the deck has 12 of each copy of land, between 4 copies of land, 4 copies of Expedition Map, 4 copies of Sylvan Scrying, and Ancient Stirrings tied together. It has many different payoffs, so there's not 1 or 2 cards you can, like, knock out of their deck, and it completely stops them from functioning and doing their thing, and it's harder to interact with things than graveyards and artifacts. So let's take a quick look at an example of a recent Tron list. The new tech being Karn the Great Creator. As I said, they have the three Urza's lands and a bunch of payoffs: Karn Liberated, Karn the Great Creator, Ugin the Spirit Dragon, Wormcoil Engine, Walking Ballista, Ulamog, plus all this new Wish sideboard with Karn the Great Creator. Mycosynth the Last can shut down all your opponent's permanents. Trinosphere obviously makes spells difficult to cast. Crucible of Worlds is kind of in the standard tech for them. Liquid Metal Coating is a 1-card combo with Karn to shut down one particular permanent. Grafdigger's Cage, etc. So as you can see, this deck benefits tremendously from the London Mulligan Rule, consistently hitting Tron on turn 3, and usually having some form of payoff. Whether that payoff is good enough for the matchup or not, it all depends on what matchup they're playing against, but a deck that definitely benefits from the London Mulligan Rule and gets more consistent. Next up, another deck that benefits greatly from the London Mulligan Rule is one of the more complicated decks in Modern, known as Amulet Titan. Basically, its goal is to get to 6 mana and play either a Primeval Titan or Karn the Great Creator or Hive Mind and kind of win the game from there. One big knock against it, as opposed to something like Tron or other decks that we'll cover, it's a very complicated deck. So quick coverage of what the deck kind of looks like. You have your Amulet of Vigor, which helps break the synergy of the Karu lands. So these lands come into play tapped usually, but they also tap for 2 mana. This makes them come into play untapped, allows you to give a quick burst of energy, and then along with things like Sakura Tribe Scout, Azusa Lost but Seeking Coalition Relic, they can rapidly get to 6 mana on turn 3 or 4, and then play Primeval Titan or Karn the Great Creator, and they have much the same Wish package that the Tron decks do. The one thing kind of holding us back is the notoriousness of this deck being a little bit more complicated, but it is definitely also a deck that benefits from the London Mulligan Rule. Next up is Neoform Combo, which is a deck that popped up after printing of War of the Spark, and since War of the Spark was not technically legal before Pro Tour London, this was a deck that was not tested or played at the Pro Tour. Basically, this is a combo deck based around the cards Allosaurus Rider along with Neoform and Eldritch Evolution, which allows you to go get a quick Gristlebrand. This deck's benefit to the new rule is 4 Allosaurus Rider, 4 Summoners packs, so 8 copies of one part of the combo, 8 copies of another part of the combo. Allows you to find the combo a little bit more consistently. Then you have a bunch of fast mana with Chancellors of the Tangle, Simian Spirit Guide, Desperate Ritual, Wild Cantor to accelerate you into a turn 1 or turn 2 go get a Gristlebrand, and then Nourishing Shoal along with Otacron Worm, Chancellor of the Tangle, etc. Allows you to draw a bunch of cards, potentially draw your entire deck, and either Lightning Storm or Laboratory Maniac your opponent out. The one knock on this deck is it is a lot more susceptible to disruption. Things like hand disruption, like Thoughtseize, Inquisition, Spell Pierce, Remand, all those cards can easily interact with the deck, along with things like Grafdigger's Cage out of the sideboard. So this deck is very, very fast, but it is very much a glass cannon, falls to disruption fairly easily. So something to keep in mind moving forward, that the London Mulligan Rule will definitely benefit this deck tremendously. Next up, one of the Boogieman of the format, Dredge. This is a graveyard-based deck that benefits tremendously from redundancy. This is a deck that frequently only needs either something like Faithless Looting or Shriekhorn to get rolling. Faithless Looting plus a Dredger and a land, Cathartic Reunion plus 2 lands and a Dredger. This deck can operate from a very low base, so it mulligans particularly well already. Throw in the London Mulligan Rule, this deck gets a lot more consistent. The biggest boon to this deck recently was the printing of Creeping Chill, which turned decks like Burn and Humans, which were previously a little bit harder matchups, because those decks tend to be a little bit more fast than the Dredge deck, turned those into actually favorable matchups. This deck is already very capable of grinding if you don't have any graveyard hate. So it's definitely a deck that benefits tremendously from the London Mulligan Rule. Has many different ways to get cards in the graveyard. On turn 1 you have Dark Blast, Faithless Looting, Shriekhorn. Turn 2 you have Life from the Loam, Dark Blast, Faithless Looting, Shriekhorn, Cathartic Reunion. So this is definitely a deck that benefits a lot from the Mulligan Rule, as it's already mulligans particularly well. The one thing that makes this deck a little bit less strenuous than something like Tron is graveyards are already one of the more attacked zones in the format due to this Izzet Phoenix. Other decks that benefit from, like Arroyo's Vengeance and such, that benefit from the graveyard. So this was a zone that already gets attacked a lot, so this deck frequently has to fight through a lot of hate in Game 2 and Game 3. That said, it does have the ability frequently to win Game 1, and therefore only really has to win one of 2 post-board games against a lot of graveyard hate. And in the post-board games with things like Assassin's Trophy, Nature's Claim, etc., can frequently find its graveyard hate, anti-hate cards now that the London Mulligan Rule is in place. So, Humans. Humans is an aggressive deck that popped up a little bit more at Pro Tour London. This is a deck that is based around human tribes. One of the things that it benefits from is if it knows what it's playing against, it can frequently mulligan to the right hate cards. You have things like Meddling Mage that can shut down single card combos, like the aforementioned Amulet Titan, playing a Meddling Mage on Titan and then playing a Meddling Mage on Engineered Explosives, and the only out they have literally left in their main deck would be something like Blast Zone. So this is a deck that benefits tremendously from knowing what hate cards to mulligan to. Things like Thalia can slow down spell-based decks like Control or Izzet Phoenix. So this is a deck that benefits tremendously from knowing what cards to mulligan to. That said, it is a critical mass aggro deck, so it can't afford to mulligan down too much, but obviously if it finds 1 or 2 of its key disruption pieces and a little bit of pressure, most of its hands are pretty functional. Then on the sideboard you have things like Gaiac Teague, Deputy of Detention, Grafdigger's Cage, whatever other colorless, so it can also run things like Damping Sphere against something like Tron. This is a deck that does benefit tremendously from the London Mulligan Rule as well. It is a very disruptive, aggressive deck, and it's probably the fastest clock of anything on this list outside of the Neoform combo deck. So this is yet another deck that benefited tremendously from the London Mulligan Rule and showed up in force at the Pro Tour London. The final deck we're going to discuss is a prison-based hate piece deck. It's probably the most flexible of prison decks as opposed to something like mono red or mono white prison. But it pretty much has a hate piece for every deck, but it is a little bit weak to artifact hate. So this deck has various hate pieces, things like Torpor Orb, shut down humans, Damping Sphere, shut down Tron, Staring Bridge to keep creatures from attacking, Witchbane Orb, shut down things like Burn, Whir of Invention ties it all together, along with a bunch of cheap artifacts, Chalice of the Voids. So this is a deck that benefits greatly from the ability to find the specific hate pieces it needs in a particular matchup. This is a deck that performed extremely well at the Pro Tour London, in which this rule was in place. However, it did have benefit from the open deck lists, so its pilots would know exactly what decks and cards they needed to focus on. So this is a deck that also benefits tremendously from the London Mulligan Rule, kind of in the opposite way that a lot of these decks on the list do, as opposed to knowing what they, being able to find the key pieces to get their deck rolling. They now know what key pieces they need to find to shut down their opponent's strategy. So this is definitely a deck to look at moving forward that might benefit from the London Mulligan Rule. Taking a quick look at the results from Pro Tour London, Mythic Championship London, however you want to name it. A lot of the decks that we've talked about are on this list: Tron, Humans, Dredge. Hardened Scales is another deck that is basically a key card deck, so it does benefit tremendously from having access to its key namesake card, so it performed exceptionally well at the Pro Tour. It's not a deck we covered, but it's certainly a deck that could benefit Amulet Titan and War Prison. 78.6%. I think was the highest day 2 conversion rate of any deck in this various decks that played at the Pro Tour. One thing to note is Neoform combo was not legal at the Pro Tour, so that is a deck that, while we're covering it in this video, was not technically legal at the Mythic Championship London, in which the Mulligan Rule was tested. So it remains to be seen how that will impact the format, if it ends up with a banning, or if things like the new Force of Negation and such help to hold it in check. So I want to know down in the comments, what decks do you think will benefit most from London Mulligan Rule? Did I forget a deck that will benefit from the rule? What decks do you think will be hurt the most by the rule? And I want to thank everybody for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and hope to see you in the next video.